The sensor array blinked with unusual patterns across the command deck. Commander Aldris watched the displays with growing curiosity as his crew worked to identify the strange readings coming from the neutral zone. Something large had appeared on their scanners, drifting without power signatures or communication signals. "Report," Aldris said, his three-fingered hands gripping the edge of his console. The Valthene had been mapping this sector for 6 cycles now, and nothing this substantial had ever appeared before. Science Officer Pren looked up from her station, confusion evident in her wide-set eyes. "Commander, the object is approximately 2 kilometers in length. Mass readings suggest dense construction, but I'm detecting no active power systems. It appears to be derelict." Aldris felt his chest tighten slightly. Derelict vessels in neutral space usually meant one of 2 things. Either someone had abandoned a ship after catastrophic failure, or it was bait for a trap. His 17 years in the Valthene fleet had taught him to suspect the latter. "Any identification markers?" he asked. Pren's fingers danced across her interface. Running comparison now against known vessel designs. "Commander, this doesn't match anything in our database. The hull configuration is unlike any species we've encountered." That made Aldris even more cautious. The Valthene Collective maintained extensive records of every spacefaring civilization within 20 sectors. An unknown design meant either a very distant species or something deliberately obscured. "Position the fleet in defensive formation," Aldris ordered. "Keep weapons charged but not targeted. I want to know what we're dealing with before we make any aggressive moves." The 12 ships under his command shifted smoothly into a protective sphere around the flagship. Aldris had commanded enough missions to know that curiosity needed to be balanced with survival instinct. Still, the opportunity to discover something new was too valuable to simply ignore. "Pren, initiate a full diagnostic scan. I want composition, internal structure, and any dormant systems identified. If there's anything alive on that vessel, I need to know." The science officer hesitated for just a moment. "Commander, a deep scan of that magnitude might be interpreted as hostile action if there are survivors aboard." "Noted," Aldris replied, "but if there are survivors, they would have responded to our hails by now. Proceed with the scan." Pren activated the scanning array, sending cascading waves of energy toward the mysterious vessel. The process would take several minutes to complete, peeling back layer after layer of the ship's construction to reveal its secrets. Aldris watched the data begin to populate his screens, showing the first readings of the outer hull. The armor was thick, remarkably thick. The scan showed it wasn't a single layer, but rather multiple plates of different materials, each designed to ablate and absorb different types of damage. Aldris had never seen such excessive protection on a civilian vessel, and even military ships rarely carried such weight. "Commander," Pren's voice carried a note of alarm. "The scan is encountering resistance at the secondary hull layer. There's some kind of adaptive shielding that's interfering with our readings." Before Aldris could respond, every console on the command deck flashed red. Alert klaxons blared for 2 seconds before cutting off abruptly. The mysterious vessel, so dark and lifeless moments before, suddenly blazed with light. Power signatures erupted across its hull as systems came online with frightening speed. "Defensive stations," Aldris shouted, but even as his crew scrambled to respond, he knew they had made a terrible mistake. The communication channel crackled to life without any request for connection. A voice came through, speaking in perfectly translated Valthene. It was calm, almost conversational, with a tone that somehow made Aldris more nervous than if it had been threatening. "Unidentified vessels, this is Captain Rebecca Hayes of the Terran Coalition ship Unbroken Promise. You are conducting unauthorized scans of a military vessel, which we interpret as preliminary hostile action. Cease your scanning immediately and withdraw to a distance of 50,000 kilometers. You have 30 seconds to comply." Aldris felt his heart's hammering in his chest. Terran. The word meant nothing to him, but the message was crystal clear. This was no derelict. The ship had been waiting, watching, analyzing his fleet with senses far more sophisticated than anything the Valthine possessed. "Cut the scan, now!" Aldris barked at Pren, who frantically shut down the sensor array. The human ship, now fully illuminated, revealed its true nature. Weapons ports dotted its surface like the scales of a deep-sea predator. Point defense turrets tracked his vessels with mechanical precision. The engines glowed with barely restrained power, ready to move despite the ship's enormous mass. "Compliance confirmed," Aldris said into the communication channel, trying to keep his voice steady. "This is Commander Aldris of the Valthine Collective. We meant no hostility. We believed your vessel to be abandoned and were attempting identification." There was a pause that felt like an eternity. Finally, Captain Hayes responded. "Understood, Commander. However, your scanning technology attempted to penetrate our security systems and catalog our weapons arrays. In Terran space, that's considered an act of military intelligence gathering. I'm willing to accept this was a misunderstanding, but I need you to transmit all data you collected during your scan." Aldris looked at Pren, who nodded reluctantly. They had no choice. Refusing would confirm hostile intent, and Aldris had no desire to test his fleet against whatever weapons that massive ship was carrying. "Transmitting now," Aldris said. As the data flowed from his ship to the human vessel, Aldris wondered what kind of species built ships that pretended to be dead, waiting in the darkness of space. What kind of military doctrine involved making your enemies think they had found something helpless, only to reveal overwhelming force at the worst possible moment? "Data received," Captain Hayes said. "Thank you for your cooperation, Commander Aldris. Now I think we should talk about proper first contact protocols. Would you be interested in learning why we build our ships the way we do?" The question sounded friendly, but Aldris heard the underlying message clearly. The humans were offering him a choice: learn from this mistake, or make a much bigger one by leaving in ignorance. He looked at the massive warship on his display and made the only sensible decision. "We would be very interested, Captain Hayes." Pren couldn't stop reviewing the scan data. Even though they had transmitted everything to the humans, the information remained in their local storage. Each new detail she uncovered made her more uncomfortable with what they had stumbled upon. "Commander," she said quietly, not wanting to alarm the rest of the crew, "you need to see these readings." Aldris moved to her station, leaning over to view her display. The data showed cross-sections of the human ship's internal structure, revealing engineering choices that seemed to defy common sense. Or perhaps they revealed a mindset that the Valthine had never encountered before. The armor alone told a disturbing story. Where Valthine ships used single-layer protection optimized for weight and efficiency, the human vessel had 7 distinct layers. The outermost was designed to vaporize under extreme heat, carrying energy away from the inner hull. The next layer absorbed kinetic impacts through a honeycomb structure that compressed and distributed force. Then came radiation shielding, followed by another kinetic layer, then thermal protection again. "They built this expecting to be hit," Pren whispered. "Not just hit, but hit repeatedly by weapons powerful enough to breach multiple defense systems." Aldris nodded slowly. "What else?" Pren pulled up the weapons inventory. "I've counted 42 primary cannon emplacements, each with independent targeting systems. There are 78 point defense turrets, and those are just the ones I could identify before the scan was blocked. But here's what troubles me most." She highlighted a section of data showing power distribution. Each weapon system has its own backup generator. If the main reactor fails, every gun can still operate independently for hours. They don't just have redundancy, Commander. They have redundancy for their redundancy. The life support specifications were equally excessive. The ship could maintain its crew for 15 standard years without resupply. Food production facilities, water recycling, air generation, all built to survive catastrophic damage to multiple sections. Emergency bulkheads could seal every 20 meters, turning the ship into dozens of independent survival pods. "Look at the medical facilities," Pren said, pulling up another section. The scan had identified surgical suites equipped with automated systems, pharmaceutical fabricators, and something labeled as combat stimulant dispensaries. There were treatment protocols for injuries that made Pren's stomach turn, burns covering 70% of body surface, traumatic limb removal, decompression exposure, radiation poisoning. The humans didn't just anticipate injuries. They anticipated horrors and had built systems to keep their crew fighting through them. Aldrich studied a schematic of the crew quarters. Even the living spaces were designed for war. Each section could be converted into a defensive position. Storage lockers contained pressure suits, emergency rations, and handheld weapons. The recreation areas included combat training rooms and tactical simulation pods. "They live in this," Aldrich said quietly. "This isn't a warship they board when needed. This is their home, and they've made their home into a fortress." Pren scrolled further through the data, finding maintenance logs that had been briefly accessible during the scan. The Unbroken Promise had been in service for 12 years. In that time, it had participated in 47 combat actions, sustained major damage 6 times, and had never failed to return to base under its own power. "Commander, there's something else." Pren's voice trembled slightly. "The reactor specifications, I've run the calculations 3 times because I couldn't believe the numbers. That ship generates 40 times more power than our flagship. 40 times. The energy output is enough to run a small planetary colony." "For what purpose?" Aldrich asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Everything runs simultaneously," Pren explained. "They can fire all weapons, maintain full shields, keep life support at maximum, run the manufacturing facilities, and still have power reserves for emergency systems. They're not choosing between defense and offense. They're doing both constantly without compromise." A junior technician approached nervously. "Sir, I've been analyzing the translation matrices from Captain Hayes's communication. The name of their ship, Unbroken Promise. I researched human linguistic databases we could access. A promise is a commitment that cannot be abandoned without dishonor. Unbroken means it has never failed." Aldrich felt a chill run through his body. The humans had named their ship as a statement of intent. They would keep their commitments no matter what tried to stop them. "Pull up the external camera feeds," Aldrich ordered. "I want to see what we're really looking at." The main display showed the human vessel in full detail now that it had powered up. It was beautiful in a terrible way, all hard angles and brutal efficiency. The hull was darker than space itself, seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. The weapons ports glowed with barely contained energy. The engines pulsed with power that could probably accelerate the massive ship to speeds that should be impossible for something so large. "They were pretending," Pren said suddenly. "When we found them dark and silent and drifting, that was deliberate. They wanted to see what we would do." "A test," Aldrich agreed. "They were testing whether we would try to help, ignore them, or attempt to take advantage of what appeared to be a helpless vessel." The communication channel activated again. Captain Hayes's voice came through, still calm and professional. "Commander Aldrich, I'm transmitting our basic technical specifications as a gesture of goodwill. I believe transparency serves us better than mystery at this point in our relationship." New data flooded into the Valthine systems. Aldrich and Pren stared at the information in growing disbelief. The technical manual was thousands of pages long, detailing systems, procedures, and capabilities. It was more information than they could process in days, but even a quick review revealed astonishing facts. The Unbroken Promise was classified as a medium patrol cruiser in the Terran fleet. Medium? Not a flagship, not a dreadnought, not even a heavy battleship. Just a standard patrol vessel assigned to routine border security. There were 2,000 ships like this, or larger in the Terran Coalition Navy. "Commander," Pren's voice was barely a whisper. "What kind of threats does humanity face that they need this much firepower just for routine patrol?" Aldrich didn't have an answer, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The Valthine Collective needed to make friends with these humans immediately, because making enemies of them would be the last mistake his people ever made. Captain Rebecca Hayes sat in her command chair reviewing the data her systems had collected on the Valthine vessels. They were well-designed ships, elegant even, optimized for exploration and peaceful scientific research. Their weapons were adequate for self-defense, but clearly not meant for prolonged combat. She almost felt guilty about the shock her ship must have given them. Almost. Tactical stand down to condition 3, she ordered. Maintain shields but power down the main batteries. Let's not look quite so threatening. Her tactical officer, a young woman named Amy Ross, nodded and adjusted the ship's posture. Dozens of weapon ports closed, and the aggressive targeting systems went passive. The unbroken promise still looked formidable, but at least it no longer appeared ready to vaporize anything. That moved. Communications, open a secure channel to Commander Aldris. Let's have a proper conversation. The Valthine commander appeared on her display, his alien features showing clear signs of stress. His skin had taken on a paler shade, and his breathing seemed slightly accelerated. Hayes had reviewed the biological data on his species during the brief wait. She knew these were signs of fear in Valthine physiology. Commander Aldris, she began, keeping her tone warm and professional. I want to apologize for the alarm we've caused. My ship's protocols are designed to respond automatically to deep scans, but I recognize that your intentions were not hostile. Aldris seemed to relax slightly. Captain Hayes, I must apologize for our intrusion. We should have been more cautious with our scanning procedures. We've reviewed the technical data you transmitted, and I confess we're somewhat overwhelmed by what we've learned. Hayes smiled. I imagine the specifications are a bit surprising. Would it help if I explained the reasoning behind our design philosophy? It might make us seem less like warmongering maniacs and more like cautious neighbors. That would be very much appreciated, Aldris replied. Hayes stood and walked to one of the large viewports in her command center. Behind her, stars stretched in every direction, infinite and beautiful and utterly uncaring about the fragile beings trying to survive among them. Commander, what do you know about Earth, about our homeworld? Very little, Aldris admitted. We've only recently become aware that humans exist. Our databases have almost no information about your species. Then let me tell you a story, Hayes said. Earth is what we call a death world. The classification isn't official, but it's accurate. Our planet has tried to kill us in every way imaginable since we first evolved consciousness. Extreme temperature variations, violent weather patterns, tectonic instability that reshapes continents, and a biosphere filled with creatures that view us as food. She pulled up a holographic display showing Earth rotating slowly in the air between them. We didn't develop technology because we were curious explorers, Commander. We developed it because our world gave us no choice. Every advancement we made was survival-driven. Fire to keep predators away, tools to hunt animals stronger than us, shelter to survive storms that could flatten forests, medicine to fight diseases that killed half our children before they reached adulthood. Aldris watched the planet with what appeared to be fascination. It looks beautiful. It is, Hayes agreed. It's also merciless. When we finally achieved spaceflight, we thought we'd escaped the worst of it. We were wrong. Space is even less forgiving than Earth ever was. No air, no pressure, radiation that shreds DNA, temperatures that swing from absolute zero to star surface heat. And we discovered we weren't alone out here. She changed the display to show humanity's early encounters with other species. Most of the civilizations we met were peaceful, curious, willing to trade and share knowledge. But not all of them. We encountered species that saw us as weak, primitive, easy targets for conquest or exploitation. Hayes's expression hardened slightly. We lost 3 colony worlds in the first 5 years of deep space exploration, not to natural disasters, Commander, to hostile action. 17,000 people died because we built our ships the way you build yours. Efficient, elegant, optimized for peaceful purposes. The display showed images of destroyed vessels, burning colonies, evacuation ships desperately trying to escape systems under attack. Aldris watched in silence, his alien features conveying a universal expression of horror. After that, we changed our philosophy, Hayes continued. We decided that we would never again be caught unprepared. We would build ships that could survive anything. We would train our crews to fight through impossible situations. We would make it so expensive to attack humanity that no one would ever think the cost was worth paying. She gestured at the unbroken promise on the display. This ship isn't designed to win battles, Commander. It's designed to not lose them. There's a difference. Winning means destroying your enemy quickly and decisively. Not losing means surviving everything they throw at you until they run out of ammunition, or energy, or will to continue fighting. The redundant systems, Aldris said quietly, understanding dawning in his voice. Exactly. We assume everything will fail eventually. So we build backups and backups for the backups and independent systems that can function even when everything else is destroyed. We train our crews to operate in vacuum, in darkness, with half the ship gone and the other half on fire. We prepare for the absolute worst-case scenario, and then prepare for it to get worse. Hayes returned to her chair. But here's what's important, Commander. We build these ships because we want peace. We prepare for war because we desperately want to avoid it. The Terran Coalition has a saying, if you want peace, prepare for war so terrible that no one dares to start one. Deterrence, Aldris said. Exactly. We're not looking to conquer anyone. We've been conquered by our own planet for millions of years, and we didn't enjoy the experience. We don't want to do that to others, but we also won't let it be done to us ever again. Hayes leaned forward. So yes, our ships are scary. They're meant to be. But we're also explorers, scientists, artists, philosophers. We want to learn from other species, share what we've discovered, build friendships across the stars. We just want to do it from a position where no one mistakes our peaceful intentions for weakness. Aldris was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. Captain Hayes, I believe the Valthine Collective would very much like to establish formal diplomatic relations with the Terran Coalition. Hayes smiled genuinely. Commander Aldris, I was hoping you'd say that. Hayes noticed the nervous energy among the Valthine crew, even through the communication channel. They had accepted her explanation, but words were just words. She had learned long ago that sometimes people needed to see capabilities demonstrated before they truly understood them. Commander Aldris, she said carefully, I'd like to propose something that might ease the concerns I can see your crew has. There's an asteroid field about 2 million kilometers from here. With your permission, I'd like to take the unbroken promise there and demonstrate exactly what our defensive philosophy looks like in practice. She saw Aldris exchange glances with his science officer. You want to show us your weapon systems? Not just weapons, Hayes corrected. I want to show you the complete integration of systems that makes human ships different. This way, you'll understand what you're dealing with when you encounter other Terran vessels. No surprises, no misunderstandings, complete transparency. Aldris considered for a moment, then nodded. We accept your offer, Captain. Hayes gave orders to her navigation officer, and the unbroken promise began moving. Despite its enormous mass, the ship accelerated. Smoothly, its engines pushing the vessel to speeds that made several Valthine officers gasp audibly. They reached the asteroid field in minutes, settling into a position among the tumbling rocks. First demonstration, Hayes announced over the open channel. Point defense systems. These are designed to protect the ship from missiles, fighters, and debris during combat maneuvers. She gave a command, and her tactical officer activated the system. Immediately, hundreds of small turrets across the hull came to life. They tracked individual asteroids with frightening precision, calculating trajectories and threat levels in microseconds. Lieutenant Ross, clear a sphere 500 meters around the ship. The point defense cannons opened fire. It wasn't the dramatic barrage that might appear in entertainment programs. Instead, it was a precise, almost surgical operation. Each turret fired short bursts, hitting tumbling asteroids with exact timing to deflect them away from the ship. Larger rocks were hit multiple times, breaking them into smaller pieces that other turrets then eliminated. In 12 seconds, the space around the unbroken promise was completely clear. Not a single piece of debris larger than a pebble remained within the defensive perimeter. Pren's voice came over the channel, shaking slightly. "Captain Hayes, I counted 342 individual targets engaged simultaneously." "That's correct," Hayes confirmed. "And the system can handle up to 2,000 targets at once if needed. Now let's move to offensive capabilities." The ship rotated slightly, bringing its main batteries to bear on a large asteroid roughly 300 meters across. Main cannons, single shot, 30% power. The weapon fired. There was no dramatic sound in space, but the visual was impressive enough. A beam of concentrated energy struck the asteroid dead center. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the entire rock exploded outward, vaporized so quickly that it didn't even have time to fragment. One moment there was a massive asteroid, the next there was a rapidly expanding cloud of glowing dust. 30%, Aldris repeated numbly. "We rarely need full power," Hayes explained. "And using less extends the operational life of the weapon systems, but if you'd like to see what full power looks like." "No, thank you," Aldris said quickly. "We understand." Hayes smiled, then, "Let's move to the interesting part. Computer, activate siege configuration." The Valthene crew watched in stunned silence as the unbroken promise transformed before their eyes. Armor plates shifted and locked into reinforced positions. Additional reactor cores came online, their signatures blooming across every sensor. Weapon ports opened all across the hull, revealing systems that had been hidden during normal operation. Pren tried to count them and gave up after reaching 200. "Commander, the entire ship is a weapons platform." "Siege mode is for defensive operations," Hayes explained. "When we need to hold a position against overwhelming numbers, the configuration sacrifices maneuverability for firepower and protection. We can maintain this stance for up to 72 hours of continuous combat before needing to resupply ammunition." She paused, then added quietly, "We've never had an engagement last more than 40 hours. Usually the opposition withdraws long before that." "Or is destroyed," Aldris muttered. "We prefer withdrawal," Hayes said firmly. "Every ship that leaves is a crew that goes home to their families. We're not interested in killing people, Commander. We're interested in making them decide that continuing to fight us isn't worth the cost." The siege configuration deactivated and the ship returned to its normal stance. But there was one more demonstration Hayes wanted to show. "Final display, emergency combat deployment." She triggered the sequence. Along the sides of the unbroken promise, bay doors opened that had been completely invisible moments before. From inside, fighter craft launched in a precisely choreographed ballet. They emerged, formed up, and took defensive positions around the main ship in exactly 12 seconds. 40 fighters, Hayes said, each carrying enough firepower to threaten vessels much larger than themselves. Each pilot trained to operate independently or as part of coordinated strike groups, and each one willing to sacrifice themselves to protect this ship and its crew. She recalled the fighters, and they docked just as quickly as they'd launched. "So you see, Commander, the Unbroken Promise isn't just a battleship. It's a mobile fortress, an artillery platform, a carrier, and a command center all in one package. And this is standard for Terran patrol vessels." Aldris took a long moment to respond. When he did, his voice was measured, carefully controlled. "Captain Hayes, you mentioned this is a medium patrol cruiser. May I ask what your larger vessels are capable of?" Hayes pulled up a schematic. "Our dreadnoughts are 3 times this size, carry 4 times the armament, and have crew complements of over 5,000. We have 12 of them in active service." The numbers hung in the space between them, heavy with implication. "But," Hayes continued, "we've never had to deploy all 12 at once. Usually the presence of one is enough to remind everyone involved that peaceful negotiation is the preferable option." She stood. "Commander, I've shown you all this not to threaten you, but to ensure you understand who we are. We're powerful, yes. We're prepared for terrible possibilities. But we're also hopeful that we'll never need to use most of what you've seen today. We'd much rather talk than fight." "I believe you, Captain," Aldrich said, "and I think my government will be very eager to begin those talks." The emergency meeting aboard the Valthine flagship had been going for 3 hours. Aldrich sat at the head of the conference table, surrounded by his senior officers and several specialists who had been analyzing every piece of data they'd collected about the humans. The mood in the room wavered between fascination and fear. "Let's review what we know," Aldrich said, trying to bring order to the discussion. "Tactical assessment first. Lieutenant Vorn, what are your conclusions?" The tactical officer pulled up a display showing the Unbroken Promise alongside Valthine vessels for comparison. "Commander, in a direct engagement between our entire fleet and that single human ship, I estimate our survival time at approximately 4 minutes. That's assuming we achieve complete tactical surprise and execute a perfect coordinated assault. In any realistic scenario, we would last less than 2 minutes." The room fell silent. Aldrich had expected the assessment to be grim, but hearing it stated so baldly was sobering. "And that's just one patrol cruiser," Pren added. "Captain Hayes mentioned there are 2,000 similar or larger vessels in their immediate operational area. The military implications are staggering." Aldrich nodded slowly. "Intelligence Officer Kren, what have you learned about human strategic deployment?" Kren was older than most of the crew, with experience that stretched back 40 years. He looked troubled as he spoke. "Commander, this is where things become truly concerning. The humans haven't expanded aggressively. According to the data Captain Hayes provided, the Terran Coalition controls only 27 star systems. That's fewer than the Valthine Collective, and were considered a minor power." "Why would they limit themselves?" someone asked. "That's what worries me," Kren replied. "They have the military capability to conquer hundreds of systems, but they choose not to. They're sitting at their borders, watching, waiting. I've analyzed their ship positions based on the deployment data Hayes shared. They've established a defensive perimeter around their territory, but they're not pushing outward." Pren leaned forward. "What if they're preparing, building strength before they launch expansion?" "I considered that," Kren said, "but the evidence doesn't support it. Their fleet hasn't grown significantly in the past 5 years. They're not building new colonies at an accelerated rate. They're not stockpiling resources beyond what's needed for defensive operations. Everything points to a species that genuinely wants to be left alone." Aldrich drummed his fingers on the table. "Or a species that's testing us, seeing if we'll be peaceful neighbors or potential threats." The room considered this in uncomfortable silence. It was Pren who finally spoke. "Commander, I've been reviewing the documentation Captain Hayes transmitted. There's a section on human rules of engagement. I think you all need to see this." She displayed the relevant information. The humans had extensive protocols governing military conduct, strict limitations on civilian casualties, requirements for proportional response, mandatory attempts at diplomatic resolution before force, medical treatment for enemy wounded, protection for surrender vessels. "They're remarkably restrained," Vorn observed. "These rules would put them at a disadvantage in many combat situations." "Keep reading," Pren said quietly. The next section detailed contingency protocols for what humans called total war scenarios. The restrictions fell away under specific conditions. When enemies targeted civilian populations deliberately, when genocide was attempted against human colonies, when enemies used weapons of mass destruction, or when surrender was refused after decisive defeat. The procedures outlined for total war were chilling in their thoroughness. Complete resource mobilization, elimination of enemy industrial capacity, destruction of military capability down to the smallest patrol craft, occupation of enemy systems until threat was permanently neutralized. "They're restrained by choice," Aldrich said slowly. "Not by necessity. They've decided to fight ethically because they believe it's right, but they've also planned for what happens if their enemies don't share those values. Kren pulled up another file. There's historical context here. 30 years ago, a species called the Dracs attacked a human agricultural colony. They killed 4,000 civilians and took another 2,000 as slaves. The human response was measured and terrifying. They tracked down every Drax military asset in 3 sectors, disabled them without destruction, then presented the Drax government with a choice. Return every single human, pay reparations, and submit to monitoring, or face complete destruction of their spacefaring capability. What did the Drax choose? Vorn asked. They returned the humans, paid the reparations, and agreed to monitoring. The Terran coalition rebuilt their disabled ships, returned them, and established a diplomatic embassy. The Drax are now one of humanity's strongest trading partners. Aldris absorbed this information. So they're capable of terrible violence but prefer to give enemies a way out, practical mercy backed by overwhelming force. Commander, Pren said hesitantly, there's something else in the historical files. It's labeled the Nevada incident. She pulled up the record, and the room fell silent as they read. 40 years prior, a human colony world called Nevada had been infected with a virulent biological agent. The pathogen was artificial, designed as a weapon, and it was spreading faster than containment could manage. The humans made a decision that none of the Valthine could comprehend. They sterilized the planet from orbit. 20,000 human colonists died. The humans killed their own people rather than risk the weapon spreading to other worlds. The report says it was a unanimous decision by their High Council, Pren whispered. They knew it would haunt them forever, but they did it anyway because they calculated it would save billions of lives elsewhere. Aldris felt sick. A species capable of such harsh mathematics was not one to be taken lightly, but what disturbed him more was the memorial section at the end. Of the file, every single name of the lost colonists was recorded. Their lives, their accomplishments, their families. The humans had honored them even as they made the terrible choice to end their lives. They're not monsters, Aldris said finally. They're survivors who have made impossible choices and carry the weight of those choices with them. That might make them more dangerous, not less. Vorn looked up from his tactical displays. Commander, recommendation. We pursue formal diplomatic relations immediately, Aldris said firmly. We make it absolutely clear that the Valthine Collective has no hostile intentions toward humanity. We offer trade, cultural exchange, mutual defense agreements if they're interested. And we make sure every ship captain in our fleet understands that encountering a human vessel requires extreme caution and respect. Should we fear them? Someone asked. Aldris thought about Captain Hayes, her willingness to be transparent, her clear preference for peace despite her vessel's terrifying capabilities. No, but we should never forget what they're capable of, and we should be grateful they've chosen to be our friends rather than our enemies. 2 days later, Aldris found himself aboard the Unbroken Promise for the first time. Captain Hayes had invited him and a small diplomatic delegation to tour the ship and discuss preliminary frameworks for formal relations between their peoples. Walking through the human vessel was an education in itself. The corridors were wider than necessary, with emergency stations every 20 meters. The walls weren't decorated with art or displays, but with emergency equipment, pressure suits, medical kits, fire suppression systems, backup communication devices. Even in the areas designed for crew comfort, the underlying purpose was unmistakable. This was a ship built to survive. Hayes met them in what she called the observation deck, a space with massive viewports showing the stars beyond. It was beautiful, almost peaceful, until Aldris noticed the blast shutters that could seal the windows in microseconds and the backup bridge equipment built into the walls. "Welcome aboard, Commander," Hayes said warmly. "I hope the tour has been informative." "Very much so," Aldris replied. "Your crew has been most gracious in explaining your systems. I have to ask, though, does it ever feel oppressive living in such a militarized environment?" Hayes, considered the question seriously. It did at first. When I was young, fresh out of the academy, I thought ships like this were excessive. I'd grown up on Earth during peacetime in a city that hadn't seen conflict in generations. I thought we were being paranoid. She walked to one of the viewports, gazing out at the stars. Then I served on a science vessel during the Outer Rim surveys. We encountered a species that didn't want to talk, didn't want to negotiate, just wanted to eliminate anything that wasn't them. We barely escaped. 30% of the crew died because our ship wasn't designed to take damage and keep fighting. Hayes turned back to Aldris. After that, I understood. This isn't paranoia. This is learning from hard experience. Every system on this ship exists because someone somewhere died when that system didn't exist. We're not preparing for imaginary threats, Commander. We're preparing for threats we've already faced and barely survived. Aldris felt the weight of that statement. Captain Hayes, I've been authorized to discuss formal diplomatic relations. The Valthine Collective would very much like to establish peaceful coexistence with the Terran Coalition. I'm pleased to hear that, Hayes said. I've been in contact with my superiors and they've given me broad authority to negotiate preliminary agreements. But before we discuss specifics, I need to ask you something important. What happened out there when you scanned my ship? How many other species have you encountered that responded the way we did? None, Aldris admitted. Most species power up their weapons and make threats. You were calm, professional, and you offered to educate us rather than simply chase us away. It was unexpected. Hayes nodded. That's because we've learned something important about surviving in a dangerous galaxy. Making enemies is easy. Making friends is hard but infinitely more valuable. Every species we've encountered has something to teach us, some perspective we lack, some technology or culture or way of thinking that makes us better. She pulled up a holographic display showing a star map. Right now, the Terran Coalition has formal diplomatic relations with 17 species. We have trade agreements, cultural exchange programs, mutual defense pacts. We share technology, art, philosophy. One species taught us better agricultural techniques that have fed billions. Another showed us new approaches to physics that revolutionized our engine designs. We've gained far more through friendship than we ever could through conquest. Aldris studied the map and the species that attacked your survey vessel. We defeated them militarily, yes, Hayes said, but we didn't destroy them. We forced them to the negotiating table, and now they're one of our trading partners. They're not friends yet, but they're not enemies anymore either. Sometimes peace requires showing that continued conflict is futile, but the goal is always to end the fighting, not to end the opponent. She changed the display to show technical specifications. I'd like to propose a framework for our initial relationship. First, complete transparency about military capabilities. We'll share our technical specifications, you share yours. No surprises, no misunderstandings. Second, establishment of formal communication protocols. Every ship captain should know how to identify friendly vessels, how to request assistance, how to avoid accidental conflicts. Third, cultural exchange programs. Your scientists visit our worlds, ours visit yours. We learn about each other's history, art, philosophy. Understanding breeds respect, and respect prevents conflict. Fourth, economic cooperation. We identify areas where trade benefits both our peoples. Technology exchange where appropriate, with safeguards to ensure neither side is exploited. And finally, Hayes said, her expression becoming more serious, mutual defense considerations. We're not asking you to fight our battles, and we don't expect you to. But if either of our peoples faces existential threats, it's worth discussing how we might support each other. Aldris listened carefully, taking notes. These all seem reasonable. The Valthine Collective would agree to these terms. But I have to ask, Captain, what if we had been hostile? What if we had responded to finding your ship with weapons fire instead of curiosity? Hayes met his eyes steadily. Then you would have learned a very different lesson about humanity. We would have defended ourselves, disabled your vessels with minimum casualties if possible, and then still offered to negotiate. We fight when we must, Commander, but we always prefer the alternative. even against overwhelming odds. Especially against overwhelming odds, that's when diplomacy matters most. Aldris felt something shift in his understanding of humanity. They weren't just powerful. They were wise in ways that most species never learned. They'd been hurt badly enough to prepare for anything, but not so badly that they'd lost their capacity for hope. Captain Hayes, I think this is the beginning of a long and beneficial friendship between our peoples. Hayes smiled. I think so too, Commander, and I can tell you that several other species have reached the same conclusion after similar encounters. You're joining what we hope will become a community of civilizations working together to make this galaxy safer and better for everyone. They finalized the preliminary agreements over the next several hours, establishing communication protocols and scheduling future meetings. As Aldris prepared to return to his ship, he paused at the airlock. Captain, one last question. You were waiting for us, weren't you? When we found you, that wasn't coincidence. Hayes's smile confirmed it. We've been monitoring your fleet's movements for weeks. We wanted to see how you'd react to finding what you thought was a helpless vessel. It tells us a lot about a species' character. And what did our reaction tell you? That the Valthine are curious, cautious, and capable of learning from mistakes. Those are exactly the qualities we hope to find in friends. Aldris returned to his ship with a full report and a growing sense of relief. The Valthine had found something rare in the galaxy, a species powerful enough to be dangerous, wise enough to be peaceful, and generous enough to share both their strength and their knowledge. The galaxy, he thought, was about to become a more interesting place.